We're going to be looking at the digestive system, and the digestive system is made up of an alimentary canal, which will begin at the oral cavity and it ends at the anus, and it is made up of accessory organs or structures which will empty into the alimentary canal. We're going to start up at the oral cavity, and the oral cavity is going to contain the tongue, which is a piece of skeletal muscle, as well as teeth. The superior part of the oral cavity is made up by the hard palate, and that is composed of the two palatine processes of the maxilla, and then more posteriorly by the palatine bones. The hard palate is going to give rise to the soft palate, which is basically muscle covered by a mucous membrane. Behind the oral cavity is a tube structure, and we call this the pharynx. Now, the pharynx has three sections to it. The section that is actually behind the nasal cavity, so in this region, this would be the nasopharynx. The section that's behind our oral cavity would be the oropharynx, and then the section that is behind this structure, which is our larynx, would be called the laryngopharynx, and we see the laryngopharynx in this area. So that entire pharynx is going to be a pathway for air that's brought in through the oral cavity or through the nasal cavity, and also for food and drink that's brought in through the oral cavity. There are three sets of tonsils of lymphatic tissue that we find in this oral cavity area. One set is known as the palatine tonsils, and they're not shown in a different color, but this oval-shaped mass, this is going to be one of the palatine tonsils. These are the ones that you can see in the back of your throat, in that pharynx. When you open your mouth and you say ah, they will be off to the sides. Behind the nasal cavity, in the nasopharynx, we have another set, and these are known as either the pharyngeal tonsils or the adenoids. Now, if you've ever had your tonsils taken out, they'll take out the palatine tonsils, and usually they also take out the adenoids. The third set of lymphatic tissue is found at the base of the tongue. It looks like part of the tongue, but this actually is the lingual tonsil. The pharynx is going to give rise to the esophagus, which is this long muscular tube that travels through the thoracic cavity. It's going to travel behind your windpipe and behind the heart. And the esophagus is going to empty into the stomach. So I'm going to remove this exterior part of our stomach and we can look into the stomach. Where the esophagus opens into the stomach, there is a sphincter, which is a band of smooth muscle. We call this sphincter the lower esophageal sphincter, or you can call it the cardiac sphincter. Coming into the stomach, the very first region that we enter into, which would be in this area, is known as the cardiac region. There is a region that is superior to that, and it would be found just above the pointer here. That region above my pointer is known as the fundic region, or the fundus. And then we've got the majority of the stomach, which is going to be this area. This is known as the body of the stomach. The very last part of the stomach is known as the pyloric region. And where it begins to narrow, this is our pyloric canal. The pyloric canal is going to be surrounded by this little piece of smooth muscle, again a circular piece, which is our pyloric sphincter. Normally, the lower esophageal sphincter and the pyloric sphincter are closed. When food comes down through the esophagus, the lower esophageal sphincter should relax and allow the food into the stomach. As the stomach fills up, this pyloric sphincter will relax and allow the food to move into the small intestine. In the interior of the stomach, we notice that there are these longitudinal folds of the mucosa and the submucosa. These are called rugae, and their job is to allow expansion of the stomach when you fill it up with food or liquid. We're now going to look at the small intestine, and I'm going to remove this little section of large intestine so we can see a larger part of the small intestine. Where the pyloric sphincter opens into the small intestine, this region, which has this nice C shape to it, continues on. This is the duodenum, or the duodenum, and this is actually the shortest piece of the small intestine. This region will receive the secretions that are coming from the pancreas. That's going to have a lot of digestive enzymes in it, and also the bile that's made in the liver, stored in the gallbladder. It will flow out through this little green duct here that you pick up at this point and empty into that duodenum. The second part of the small intestine is known as the jejunum, and it is this slightly darker pink region that we see here in the model. In the jejunum, this is where we have the majority of the digestion and absorption of nutrients. When we move into the third section, that is the ileum. It's a little lighter pink color, and the ileum will actually feed into the large intestine. Again, there is a circular band of muscle that we see right here. It's called the ileocecal sphincter, and normally it's closed until you get a reflex mechanism that moves food through the small intestine. At that point, the ileocecal sphincter will open and allow the food to move into the large intestine. We're now going to look at the large intestine, and the very first part of the large intestine is this small pouch-like structure that hangs down below the ileocecal sphincter. This is known as the cecum. And the cecum is sort of like that fundus. It allows a little extra space for food coming from the small intestine to enter into the large intestine. Coming off of the cecum is this closed-ended tube. It looks a little bit like a worm. This is known as the vermiform appendix. And in the wall of the vermiform appendix, you have some lymphatic tissue there. We don't really understand the true function of the appendix, but we know that you can live without it. This region of the large intestine that is coming up on the right side of the abdominal cavity, this is known as the ascending colon. The ascending colon is going to make a 90-degree turn when this region actually hits the liver. The liver in this picture, in this model, is flipped up. Normally it would be down, resting right above that part of the large intestine. When we make this 90-degree turn, that area is known as the hepatic flexure. We then enter into this straight piece of the large intestine. This is called the transverse colon. When we get over to the left side of the abdominal cavity, that transverse colon is going to hit the spleen, and we have another 90-degree turn. This is known as the splenic flexure. We then enter into the descending colon. This is coming down on the left side of the abdominal cavity, and when that descending colon reaches the brim of the pelvic cavity, it has to make an S-shaped curve, which is not well shown in the model, but it would be around this region. That S-shaped portion of the large intestine is called the sigmoid colon. The sigmoid colon is going to enter into the rectum, which we see here, and the rectum is only about 2.5 inches in length. This is a storage site for your feces. The very last part of the intestine is known as the anal canal, and the anal canal has its opening to the outside of the body in the anus. The anus is actually the opening. If you look at the mucosa in this anal canal, you again notice these longitudinal folds. These are called the anal columns, and their purpose is again to allow for expansion of that part of the intestine when it fills up with your waste product. There are two bands of smooth muscle, sphincters, that will surround the opening of the anus. The one that we see here that's rather thin, that's just underneath the mucosa and the submucosa, is known as the internal anal sphincter. And this is smooth muscle under involuntary control. The second sphincter we see here and here, this is the external anal sphincter, and this is skeletal muscle, which is under voluntary control. The other parts of the digestive system are what we call either the accessory organs or the accessory structures, and these are going to be organs or structures where food does not run through them. These are going to produce a secretion that is going to be necessary for the whole process of digestion and absorption. So the salivary glands are part of these accessory structures, and they will be located just adjacent to the oral cavity. We don't really see them in this model. We'll look at those in another model, but those are considered part of the accessory structures. Our liver is also an accessory organ. The liver's big function in digestion is that it makes bile. Now, bile is made by the hepatocytes in the liver. It will flow out of the liver through a duct system that we see in green here. There are two ducts that drain the bile from the liver. We have the left hepatic duct, and then we have the right hepatic duct. Where these two little ducts come together, they form the common hepatic duct, which is really at the very tip of my pointer here. This common hepatic duct is going to fuse with this duct, which is coming from the gallbladder. This is known as the cystic duct. When the cystic duct and the common hepatic duct fuse, They form the duct that we see here. It picks up at this point, you see the green duct running from behind the duodenum. This is known as the common bile duct. Now the bile is produced in the liver, but it is stored in the gallbladder. And the gallbladder is going to release the bile in a very coordinated fashion so that the bile will enter into this duodenum when your food is coming in from the stomach. The bile is going to help with the emulsification of fats, and this allows your large particles of fat to be basically broken down into smaller particles, which gives more surface area for the digestive enzymes, the lipase that comes from that pancreas, to actually work on, so you get better digestion of your fats. The pancreas is this orangish organ that we see here. I'm going to remove this part of the large intestine so we get a little better view of it. The pancreas, remember, does have an endocrine function. It makes hormones. It makes the hormones insulin and glucagon, which are going to be important in controlling your blood sugar. The role of the pancreas in digestion is its exocrine function, and the pancreas is going to produce several types of digestive enzymes. Several of them will break down your proteins and your very short chains of amino acids that we call peptidases. These are things such as carboxypeptidase, trypsin. It also secretes an enzyme that will break down fats. We call it pancreatic lipase. It also secretes an enzyme that will help to break down carbohydrates, and that is called pancreatic amylase. Now, those digestive enzymes are going to be secreted into this duct system, which will empty into the small intestine.